All right. Hello, everybody. It's 1 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to our monthly webinar for the River Field Studies Network group. Great to see you all. Today, we're going to be talking with Dr. Emily Ward, who is now with CIRES at University of Colorado at Boulder, and we're going to be talking about assessment strategies for field studies and field courses, learning outcomes, that type of thing. Emily is going to give a presentation of her work for probably about the first 20-25 minutes-ish or so that we'll do, and then we'll have an opportunity to just have a general discussion. Folks can raise their hands and ask questions of Emily in responses, and then after that, when we're completed with that, we'll go ahead and end the network-wide webinar for today, and we'll ask that the 2022 River Scholars stay on, and we'll have some continued discussion with the smaller group after that. So Emily, thank you so much for coming and presenting with everybody here today. And we really look forward to hearing what you have to say and having a discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to talk about assessment today. Can you guys all see my slides all right? It's so hard when there's like multiple monitors and stuff. I never know what I'm actually showing. So thanks for the thumbs up there. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned, I'm with CIRES right now. I'm an education outreach associate with that research group. And I'm also a steering committee member for the Undergraduate Field Experiences Research Network, or also called UFERN, who is a collaborator with the Rivers Network. And I've been asked to kind of serve as a assessment consultant to the Rivers Network. And today I'll be speaking to you about how to kind of develop an assessment strategy for your field course or lesson. Let's see if I can advance my slides now. Okay, so we'll begin the webinar today just kind of setting the stage with some definitions for the different scales of assessment that you might be involved in, different approaches or methods of assessment that you might consider, and then also kind of setting the stage for terminology to make sure we have a common understanding of the terms that we're talking about. And then I'll introduce the backward design approach for curriculum development. And I've built in some interactive time for us, really looking at specific language and learning outcomes. Hopefully you guys have maybe an example learning outcome that you'd like to kind of talk about or discuss today. And then think about what sort of assessment methods would be useful in gathering information to see if we've actually achieved that learning outcome. So to give you some context about my position in assessment work, I'm a trained geologist who went on after graduate school for a postdoc in geoscience education research at Michigan State University. My assessment experience is pretty varied. I have experience as a program evaluator on NSF projects, so kind of looking at the multi-institutional scale. My personal interest is in discipline-based education research in geosciences, specifically place-based education and the assessment of place-based education. But also before CIRES, I was an associate professor of geology, and so I served my campus committee for assessment. And so I have some experience thinking about assessment at the campus-wide scale as well. And then, of course, in my current position, I design curriculum, I do evaluation of projects, and I also do education research. So I'm kind of, I've got my hands in a lot of different pots. And so I think I can kind of relate to some of the different contexts that you guys will be bringing to the table today. So I do want to kind of start out with get a sense for the prior experience in the group. And you can, feel free to use the Zoom raise your hand if you want. You don't have to. You can also just physically raise your hand because I think I can see some folks have their camera on. For those that don't have their camera on, that's fine. You can just raise your hand with Zoom. I want to have a sense for how many have experienced writing learning outcomes. And you can think about this either maybe writing a learning outcome for your courses or even for your programs. Okay, good. Seeing lots of hands there. And then how about for just courses, programs? The chat is great too. I can see that. And then also, how about lessons? Have you ever written outcomes at the lesson scale? Okay. All right. And then how many have experience in assessing the student learning in your class, just specifically in a class that you teach? Okay, great. And how about across multiple classes, maybe like majors? Okay, good. And anybody had the pleasure of serving on their campus assessment committee at all? Okay, yeah, I've got a few. All right, so some different scales there, awesome. And then lastly, how do you typically use the assessment data that you collect? Is it really just to inform your own practice, or are you regularly reporting it to others? So let's go with informing our own practice first. Okay, and then how many are using it to actually report to some other entity, either campus or maybe a grant, a funder? Okay, fewer, some of those. Okay, good. All right, awesome. So we've got some nice mix of experience here. So let's get started. I just really want to get a sense for today, just talking about, again, coming to some common understanding. So setting the stage for the assessment. So there are different scales of assessment to consider. We can think about assessment happening at kind of this large scale, maybe multi-institutional, and a good example of that would be the RIVERS network, right? We've got a lot of faculty from different institutions, and so maybe the assessment strategy for the network is going to be to think about, how well are they creating the network, how are the collaborations going, and that's what the assessment would be geared toward. We can also think about assessment at the institutional scale, especially the single institution. And again, as I mentioned, there might be various aspects of that you might be looking at: general education curriculum, maybe your major, trying to assess at that scale. Some of you might even have grad programs that you're interested in assessing. So again, that's another scale of assessment, slightly smaller than the multi-institutional scale. But the scale of assessment that we're going to be working with in this webinar, and how I want you to be thinking about assessment, is really going to be focused on either a single course that you teach, perhaps a suite of lessons that could be packaged as a module or a unit that happens over a couple of weeks, or even so specific to a single lesson. Okay, so that is the scale that I'm going to be framing this discussion around. And we're going to be thinking about assessment strategies that work for that scale of assessment. When I'm talking about the lesson scale too, and I think that the definitions could be varied here as well, what I'm envisioning is something like a lab session, something that can happen in a single day. Okay, so for a lesson, that's kind of the scale that we're working with here. So let's go ahead and start talking about how we might approach assessment of our lessons or our courses. So we can do this by taking a backwards design approach. And instead of thinking about the activities that you're going to be doing with your students, the backwards design approach has you kind of think about what are the goals or outcomes that you're hoping to achieve with your students before you design the lessons and activities. And so this approach has you focus on the goals and outcomes first. And just so that we're all on the same page, a lot of times you might hear goals, objectives, outcomes, all kind of used interchangeably when you're talking about assessment. And really, they do have more specific definitions. So if you're thinking about like in the educational research realm, goals are really kind of these big picture ideas that, the broad goal for the course. So for example, I'm just going to draw from my experience in geology. A goal that I might have for my lesson is I'm going to introduce my students to the fluvial geomorphology of the Yellowstone River. And that's a pretty big picture thing, right? But it gives you some general idea of what I'm hoping to start to talk about in my lesson. If I want to get even more specific, though, I might start thinking about individual objectives, something that's a little bit more bite-sized, a little bit easier to kind of understand exactly what does that mean, you know, the fluvial geomorphology of the Yellowstone River. Well, maybe I really want my students to understand how different processes produce different landforms, right? So that's kind of an objective, but again, it's pretty big, right? So if we're thinking about a student learning outcome, really what we want to be looking at is something really specific that we're going to be able to gather information from our students to see if they've actually achieved that goal. And so for an outcome that would be specific, maybe I'm getting down to the real nitty gritty. I really want them to be able to identify the location of different landforms from a topographic map or an aerial photo. Okay, so that's something that we can do as a class, and it's something that I can easily measure with a particular assessment. So it's very specific. So if we're thinking about these learning outcomes, and again, thinking about that specific scale, different learning outcomes can kind of target different domains of learning. And so these three big domains of learning, we can start out with the cognitive domain of learning. This is really based on Bloom's work in the 1950s, but this is your content knowledge, this is conceptual understanding. An example would be, you know, describing how historic and present day geologic processes shape Earth's surface, okay, for example. We have psychomotor domain of learning, and that's kind of a physical skill, something that students are able to do physically. You can think about different field skills. Maybe I'm interested in how students are going to map different rock types to produce a geologic map. That might be an outcome that would be considered psychomotor. And then we have the third type of learning domain, the affective domain, and that's really looking at students' emotions and feelings, their confidence in something. And so maybe that outcome would read differently. Maybe I'm interested in designing a lesson that gets students to have an emotional attachment to a particular place, okay? So outcomes can target different domains, and so they might have different language associated with them. What I'd like to do now is actually get a sense for some of the outcomes that you all use in your field lessons. And I have a Jamboard here. So if you want to go ahead and click on that link, it'll take you to the Jamboard. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to share the Jamboard if that works for you all. And while you're waiting for me to pull it up and share, please go ahead and use the sticky note function in the Jamboard to maybe put down a student learning outcome that you have for one of your field courses. We'll use a few minutes just to kind of do that. Are you all able to see my Jamboard now on the screen? Do you also see other parts of my screen or just the Jamboard? Just the Jamboard. Okay, good. Has everybody had a chance to put in something, an example that they would like to, or anybody that need a little bit more time? I'm happy to give you that time. So some really great examples of learning outcomes. You know, one thing that helps me when I write out a learning outcome sometimes to make sure that I'm writing it from, you know, really focused on the student. I think about how the outcome might read if I add students will be able to the first part of the outcome. And so that kind of helps me focus that topic. Oh, good. We're getting more in here too. Awesome. And so what I'm seeing in here with our different outcomes is a lot of from the cognitive domain, or that kind of, you know, querying content knowledge, but also a lot of that psychomotor, some of the skills stuff too, like collecting data, using field equipment correctly. And I'm also seeing, I did see some that we're kind of looking at student emotions, like sense of belonging, I believe I saw. And it's moved. Oh yeah, greater sense of belonging to the scientific community. So that's an interesting one too, right? Like feeling like you're part of the community of science. Would anyone like to kind of describe the context for their student outcome? I'm also happy to pick my favorites when I look at the ones that I have in here, but does somebody want to talk about you know, why they have that particular outcome for their field class or lesson that they do or are thinking about designing? Okay, good, because now I get to pick on the ones that I was interested in myself. So I was very interested in the students will be able to articulate the ancestral history and human relationality to the river. Whose student outcome was that particular one?
That was mine, Emily.
Oh, hey, Joseph.
How you doing?
I'm good. Good to see you. So yeah, talk to us about that particular outcome, and maybe help us unpack that a little bit. There seems to be, you know, obviously some content knowledge that is needed there, but kind of making connections as well. Can you give us a little bit more information about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm kind of I'm working on lessons that connect students, either tribal students or students from other universities, to the river and to the history of the river and the particular communities that have lived there, and how they sort of the stories that they have about the river, how they related to it in terms of, you know, both their own personal sustenance, but also you know, what they gave back to the river, the reciprocity and relationality part of it. So you know, connecting with local tribal communities would be a goal, perhaps a specific goal of the course, and you know, being able to articulate what this particular place meant to the people that have been there for thousands of years.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like an awesome course that you're designing there, and a really you know, interesting and clear outcome that is more complex than just like be able to use a Brunton compass, right? So you can see the differences in kind of the language that we hear, or that we have here too. So what else? Oh, another one that's in blue, actually, demonstrate ability to properly collect water samples and water quality analysis. That one seems, you know, very skills focused. Whose contribution was that?
Hey, Emily, that's Elise.
Oh, nice, nice. Elise, give us some context there.
Sure. So when I'm putting together field courses, I have each lesson be mainly skills based, and they don't realize that they're putting together the bigger picture, participating in the process of science. And so for each of my lessons, I have at least one of these that's just a skill as like a baseline kind of skill that you're able to do. I think I've talked to John about this before, and he also does this because they're able to then apply these skills to their own defined research projects. So I give them an assignment in a lesson where they practice that skill, and then they have it in their toolbox, so they're able to answer questions that they want to answer, research questions that they want to answer.
Great. So it's kind of like built into, kind of scaffolded in. You're giving them a skill building exercise that then they can build on for later in the course to be able to do more as part of the research process. Very cool. Awesome. And then, so another one here, I see benefits of collaboration is an interesting one here. I am interested in the sense of belonging to the scientific community. Is somebody using that outcome as part of their course or wants to build a sense of belonging in their students? Who is interested in that?
That was me.
Oh, and John, great. So there are a few that are interested in that. Great. Yeah, talk to me about how you see doing that in your course.
Also, basically addressing the larger issue of students graduating with degrees in science, never actually having done science, like
Oh, I think you're losing your audio there, John.
Right. So students graduate not really being real scientists and don't feel like they are because all they've ever done is follow recipes given to them, and they've never actually conducted what we call authentic science. And so one of my goals is to develop the competence and confidence that they actually are scientists because they've done it, they know how to do it, they can do it, and therefore they belong in the larger scientific community.
Great. So, thinking about how that might inform your activities and your design of what you would do in your class, if that's your, one of your goals or your specific outcomes for students, that's really cool. So I'm happy to see this variety, and I want to go back to, if I may, some of the slides so that we can begin to build on some of, if we're thinking about our outcomes, we have a clear idea of what we want our students to achieve. How can we then start to design assessment? And I should mention that when we're talking about outcomes, the language that you use in, writing a student outcome, it can in itself be scaffolded, right? It can have various levels of complexity in terms of what the student is having to do. So we talked to Joseph about his outcome is pretty high level, kind of querying the top of this particular pyramid. If we're thinking about, evaluating or analyzing something, that's requiring the student to put in a little bit more critical thinking than simply remembering something or defining a term, right? Which would be lower level. A lower level outcome in terms of what the student has to do. So you can even get that in the weeds if you want to, in terms of writing an outcome in that way. Certainly an intro class might have lower level outcomes maybe to start than something in a capstone course for a major, right? So this is a really texty slide, and I don't want you to read all the stuff. But what I have it up here for is that UFERN, the Undergraduate Field Experiences Research Network, and the RIVERS Network have surveyed their faculty members in the network and asked for, tried to get a sense for, are there some common student learning outcomes for people that teach in the field? And so UFERN is really focused on, field work in general, but certainly the RIVERS group is really focused on faculty that are teaching in a river context. So this slide here is essentially listing from that survey data the various student learning outcomes that were identified by faculty. And so there's quite a few here. And on the left-hand side of that table, it's kind of categorizing the outcomes. So a lot of them might be interested in connecting to place, right? Kind of thinking about connections to a particular location or community. Others are looking at skill building and content knowledge, transferable skills being another. So there is some variability in what some of the field faculty are interested in achieving with their students. The bolded text are the outcomes that the RIVERS faculty had seen specifically for the river context. Okay, so notice there's quite a few in the, sense of community, sense of place, also in terms of content knowledge, building skills, especially field-based skills, but also some interest in making, having it that students are interested in going into science beyond, just their single course or graduating with a degree, right? So just to give you a sense for what the network-wide outcomes of interest are, I just wanted to share with you that. So let's now focus on how are we going to gather the information that we need to see that we've achieved those outcomes. And so we'll focus now on assessment in our backward design process. And so when you're thinking about putting together an assessment plan, you're going to want to, consider different assessment approaches. You can think about conducting formative assessment, which is something that you would do within your class at different points along the way to see how your students, checking in with students, making sure they're getting the information that they need, versus a summative assessment, which would be something like at the end of the course or maybe after a lesson has been done with your students to see if they gathered the information from the curricula or from the lesson. You'll want to consider what type of data you're interested in. Do you want qualitative data, that you can gather from essay questions or from papers, or maybe you want quantitative data that's, maybe easier or faster to evaluate or analyze. And so you might think about multiple choice or content knowledge questions, things like that. You can also think about the type of measurements, assessment measures. Some of those you can get directly from student work, right? And see their student product, what did they produce? Or you could gather information in indirect ways by asking the student to self-report. So often those, the information that you're gathering about student confidence or things like that, they might actually be, assessing of themselves and reporting to you how they feel. And so there are other considerations besides these to think about, how are the data going to be used? Are they for your own use, for improving instruction? Or is this something that you have to report out to somebody else? So that's maybe that dictates the type of information that you gather. Do you have a lot of time to analyze the data? So are you really interested in thematic coding of open-ended responses from your students to get a sense for what they're coming away with? Or do you need something that's a little bit faster to analyze? Or you can do a combination of the two, right? And then it's also really important to get a sense for what are your students coming in with? What is their prior skill level, their experience, their knowledge? Because that's going to kind of dictate potentially what type of assessment you use, what sort of information you're gathering from them as well. So these are all sorts of things that you want to consider when you design your assessment plan. Let me just provide you some instruments, some assessment instruments that fall under these different categories. So for formative assessment, where you're just checking in with your students, there are a lot of ways to do that. And this is all coming from the Science Education Resource Center materials. They are for the intro geology classes context, but I think they do apply to other disciplines as well. So you can do that with concept tests or clicker questions. Many of you may be doing that in your classes now. Minute papers are a good way to have students reflect on a particular prompt and see where their thinking might be at before you, to see if they're, to gauge their understanding of a particular concept. You can have them do self-evaluations. Of course, journaling is a good way to do that. And I really like concept maps or concept sketches. And this comes into the field as well. And I have an example that I'm going to show you where we can use concept sketching to kind of get a sense for student understanding. And then, of course, summative assessments. Again, some of these might be familiar to you already, doing a term paper, a research poster, an oral presentation. Of course, we use exams already. Field reports are often very popular. I know people that are using portfolios to kind of show kind of the breadth of change that a student has undergone in a particular class, Google Earth field trips, there's many different student products that you can have that do assess student knowledge. And so these are just some examples that you might want to use. So, thinking about how you go from outcome to what type of assessment you want to use, and then how do you design your activity. I found it useful. I put together this template where you might, want to see alignment among those things. So identifying what your outcome is, and then thinking about the assessment. And really that's just like, what is the assignment going to be that gathers the information I need that tells me that that student met that outcome? Okay, so that is assessment. And it can come in a variety of forms. And then go ahead and talk about, okay, how am I going to teach the material to make sure that my students, reach the desired learning outcome? So this is a template that I like to use, and certainly one that I'll share with you all if you'd like to organize your thoughts in kind of doing that backward design. So I do have an example here, but I think what I want to do is go back to our Jamboard. Do you see that? We'll go back to that same link, and we'll go to the second slide, because now that we've thought about the outcomes themselves, we're going to want to consider how we get that information. What kind of assessment method might we use? So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. And I put an example on there. If you can see that, I'm going to share a different thing here. Okay, there's my Jamboard. So if you remember, I think I had an example. I wanted students to be able to identify landforms or something on a map. And so I'm going to actually, my assessment is going to have them make a surficial geologic map. And that would be kind of a summative assessment type that I would have. I'll give you a few minutes to think about that outcome that you had put down. And then how would you assess whether or not they learned or achieved that outcome? And again, just use that sticky note function to maybe type out an assessment that you had thought of for that sort of student product. Could they turn into you? Great. I'm seeing a lot of cool things here. Reports, presentations, other student products, art, stories, Others might involve an observation protocol. So somebody asks, are students sweeping camp before launching without instructor prompting? I would take the 5 minutes and just have a sense looking at the different students, seeing what sort of activities that they're doing. Maybe that's an observation protocol that you could come up with and kind of jot down that information. How well did they run a rapid? Is the boat upright with all passengers on board? All good things, right? And maybe you would design a rubric that would give you some variability there, right? So you have people that are doing it and performing it excellent, and everything is super tight, but some people that are pretty close, right? So yeah, rubric gives you that sense for evaluating somebody. I love Joseph. Yeah, exactly. Is the boat upright? So rubrics are really good to kind of get a sense for, the gradation or assessing, information in that way, observational information. Yep, field quizzes, reports, these are all great. And a lot of these I think are more summative in their nature, right? So let's start to think now about, I'm going to give you an example and how we can put both formative and summative things together and think about the different approaches to assessment here. So I'm going to start to share my slides again. Okay. All right, so here's an example, just a very basic one, again, drawing on my geology background here. So if I'm thinking about a field-based lesson that I want to do with my students, and I want them to be able to interpret the processes that create a particular landform, right? So some of the fluvial landforms that we're looking at in the Yellowstone River, right? Going with my original example. And also I want them to be improve their field observation skills. So those are just maybe 2 outcomes that I want to come away with from a field lesson that we do in the afternoon. So how would I approach that? So if my assessment goal is really just to evaluate my own instruction, to see if the lesson was effective, I might approach it in some way like this. I would use what are called embedded assessments. These are assessments that we're all very familiar with as faculty, that we embed within the lesson itself. So I might, in the field, assess my students' prior knowledge, to get a sense for what they're at, what's their skill level coming in, and that will really guide the way that I'm going to instruct them. And so because I'm interested in their field observation skills, I might have them do an annotated field sketch to start out, right? To make some field observations where we are, have them draw the landscape, try to identify landforms, maybe how they form. Okay, and so then I would have my teaching activity that would be really geared toward either, tackling the field observation skills or really getting a sense for, the relationship between process and form in terms of geological processes and landforms. And then I might build in a little check-in, so a formative assessment in that lesson to see where students are at. And these can be really short. They don't have to be very long, and they don't even have to be something that is turned into you, right? So these can be like a think, pair, share. And I don't know how many of you have heard that sort of term before, but I really like the think, pair, share, have students individually think on their own. And then, maybe they're wrestling with interpreting how a particular landform that they're looking at has formed. They think about it on their own, they partner up with somebody else, they share their ideas, and then talk as a group to see where people are at. And so that gives us a good gauge of how students are, what they're gathering from the activity. Then again, you design more teaching and instruction, and then assess the student knowledge at the end. And often with my summative assessments, I like to do the same thing that I did in the pre-assessment. So I had them do an annotated field sketch to start out. I'm going to have them do another annotated field sketch again at the end, and I'm going to look at the change in their sketches to see, did they show improvement in certain aspects? Another summative assessment that I will definitely have them do, and it's not something I would collect in the field, would probably be a field report, right? So this is something that they would, put all their information together and package it up nicely, and I would be assessing not only their field observation skills, but how are they writing and synthesizing their work as well, okay? So that's, something familiar to you guys. I know that this is stuff that you are doing and what you're working on. If your research goal is to assess student learning, then your assessment strategy might be a little bit different. Certainly your embedded assessments are getting at student learning, but if you're thinking about it from a research perspective, you're going to want to select assessment instruments that are considered valid and reliable. These are ones that have been developed by researchers that really pay attention to like the language that's being used in the assessments. Is it a language that's easily understood in a broad population of students? Essentially saying, do these assessments test what they think they're testing, right? So if you select a nice assessment, you can use those assessments in a pre-post sort of assessment strategy, give the students this assessment beforehand, then use the same assessment at the end and see if there's any gains in knowledge or whatever it is that you're trying to query, what outcomes you're hoping that your students achieve. Now, CIRES, our group, the UFERN group, has put together or identified a collection of assessments that we think are applicable to field studies. And we have built them into an online assessment portal from the CIRES portal here. And so that is something that if you're interested in assessing your student learning, you could have access to that assessment portal for some of the pre-post testing. You can select questions that make sense for your field experience, and it produces a report for you that you can use in both evaluating your own instruction, but also reporting to other people if you need to do that. So I'm plugging that for you. All right, so I'm finalizing now with the activities, and this is what the River Scholars are going to be working on for the next months, right, is putting together their activities. And really what I've done is tried to lay the groundwork for what are some outcomes that you're interested in, how are you going to assess them? And the Rivers Scholars have a template that they can work through that essentially walks them through that backward design process and all of the considerations that you might be, want to be thinking about as you design a field lesson. And just to take home the following things, I want you to be thinking about backward design as a way to kind of turn, the curriculum design on its head. We often think about the activities we want to do with our students, but and then work backwards from that. But really, this way of designing and thinking is about using a backwards design approach. What do you want your students to achieve, and then design it around that. Your assessment plans should be, a mix of approaches. You want to have a little bit of formative, a little bit of summative, maybe some qualitative data, some quantitative data collection in that. You want to have things that are direct measures of student learning and also self-report. And you really want those assessments to be aligned with what it is you're trying to assess, right? It's really speaking to the outcome achievement. So you don't want to pick a assessment method that's not going to give you the information for the outcome that you're wanting to assess. And of course, this is an iterative process. You're going to refine this. It'll be better every time you do it. But we'll give it a shot today in our scholars time to be working through trying to design an assessment plan. So I guess I'll just open it up for questions here if there's any from the broader group. And I can see that chat box too. Sometimes I'm not good about monitoring if you don't want to ask any questions here.
So Emily, thanks a bunch. It's not really a question, so it's going to be worded a little bit awkwardly, but I want to say that I really like and am interested in the kinds of outcomes that Joseph was talking about and some others posted, but I am uncomfortable understanding how to assess them. And even if we figure out a way to assess them, how I will evaluate those assessments that the students do. And so if you could just speak any more to that. I'm more comfortable with ones that I can measure quantitatively, I guess is one way to put it. And so I'd love to hear more about how we can, in sort of a rigorous way, evaluate student accomplishments on those assessments, because I think they're really important and I'd like to start including them. but I'm not that comfortable with them.
Yeah, yeah, actually, that's a good point, Elise. And it's good that you're thinking about like how you interpret student responses too when they're talking about things like their feelings and emotions. And, it sounds like you're thinking about your own lens and how you're interpreting that. And I think that's a good way to be reflective about it. There are some assessment instruments that were designed for research that are quantitative, actually, that collect quantitative data that you can use in a pre-post sort of way, that get at like sense of belonging, sense of place in some ways, like how attached you feel to a particular place. And those might be something that you could be interested in. They are quantitative, so they're like a Likert scale sort of response to a particular prompt. And those have been designed particularly for that purpose. But some of those things, right, it might have to be open-ended responses. And again, that would be really, you'd have to think about the student context, right? Like, do you want to do this with your intro class of 50 students, right? Or do you want to do this with your capstone students and you've got 5, right? And you know them because you've had them over the last 4 years, right? Like that's going to be in a different interpretation. And I think when we get to the scholars time here too, I bet Joseph has some nice examples that he's used in kind of getting at that. But certainly there are instruments out there that I can point you in that direction.
Thanks.
Hi, Emily. I have a question, Danielle here. And one thing that I've been really interested in recently is differentiating by readiness for students. And one thing that I've really struggled with is the assessment part of that. So being able to assess student success almost individually. Mm-hmm. So not everyone is meeting the same outcome goal. And that's what I would expect based on what they came in with, that prior knowledge.
Yes.
I don't know if you could speak to a little bit of that, or if you have any good resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you can use that pre-post sort of assessment and understanding that people are going to be coming in with different levels of experience. And that is the context in which you would report that, right? Not everybody's going to be expert rowers. So, and they're going to be coming in with different experience, but what you can show with the pre-post sort of assessment strategy is learning gains, right, in those particular skills. So even if they're not coming in at the same level, that's okay. But as long as you're showing that they're all gaining in a particular, way, or the strength of increase in their knowledge, that is something that you can report. And even if they're not ending all or achieving that outcome in the same, like they're not all excellent rowers by the end, you do see some change in growth from a pre-post sort of a strategy there. So that's how I would approach that.
Thank you. No, that makes a lot of sense. I really like that pre-assessment method.
Okay, maybe we'll, I'm trying to be mindful of time. We're at about 1:50. Is there any last questions, perhaps maybe from folks who are not the scholars, to give an opportunity to ask a question? I know Emily is also very generous with her time, and I'm sure wouldn't mind an email follow-up also, because she's great that way. But yeah.
Yeah, please feel free to contact me. I've got my contact information on the slide there. If you need to get in touch with me, happy to chat assessment.
Okay. Maybe Andy, if you want to give, I think we had another quick announcement before we wrap up the main network-wide part of the webinar here today.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I just a quick announcement, sort of open thing. The River Network is interested in running a network-wide assessment. And so we're sort of preliminary conversations with Emily on how to pilot a project like this. So stay tuned. We'll be reaching out to folks. We're looking for people who are doing river field courses this season, whether it be spring, summer, fall. and we can pilot this project. So that's all I'll say now, but again, stay tuned and hopefully there's more coming on that one.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. So just as a reminder, we're recording this. All of the webinars get posted up onto the Riverfield Studies Network website. So this information will be available. There's been a request for some of the resources too. So we could, Emily, maybe make a PDF from your slides or something that has clickable links in there for folks. There's also a request to provide a link to the CIMER online assessment portal. So we'll follow up and make sure that we get all this information posted out on the network for everybody to share. So great, thanks, Andy. Andy just posted that link into the chat there, if you want to grab that before we head out. So, all right, well, thank you, Emily. Very much appreciate the time. Super useful, I'm sure, for a lot of us. I know for myself included, a lot of this is the formality of a lot of these assessments is a bit new to me. So I really appreciate learning about this, as I'm sure everybody else does. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording and we will say goodbye to our regular network folks and wish you well on your Friday and the rest of your weekend. And if the River Scholars can hang around, we'll sort of continue some discussion here in just a minute or two. Thanks.